I started investigating the Great Fire of London because of a single question that wouldn't leave me alone. How do you destroy 13,200 houses in 4 days? That's what the official record says. September 2nd through September 6th, 1666. 4 days. The medieval city of London reduced to ash. 80% of everything inside the old Roman walls simply gone. But the more I researched what burned, the more disturbed I became, because this wasn't random destruction. The fire moved with purpose. It consumed specific buildings in a specific order. And the first things to burn were the places where London kept its memory. The Guildhall, the civic records, the Royal Exchange, St. Paul's Cathedral with its library, the company halls with their centuries of documentation. All of it reduced to ash before the fire spread to residential areas. If you wanted to erase a city's history, this is exactly how you do it. You'd start with the records, and then you'd burn everything else, and when you were done, you'd rebuild it differently. New architecture, new street widths, new materials, new rules. As if the old city never existed. Let me show you what really happened in September 1666. The fire started just after midnight, on Sunday, September 2nd, 1666, in Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane. Farriner was the king's baker. He supplied hardtack biscuits to the Royal Navy. Before going to bed that night, he claimed he checked his ovens and raked the coals. Everything seemed safe. But 3 hours later, at 1 a.m., his house was an inferno. The family escaped through an upstairs window to the neighboring house, all except their maidservant. She was too frightened to climb out the window. She became the fire's first victim. Her body was never found, just ash. Within an hour, the fire had spread to 6 neighboring houses. Parish constables arrived and recommended tearing down adjacent buildings to create a firebreak. Standard procedure, the only way to stop fires in 1666. But the property owners refused. They didn't want their houses destroyed. So the constables summoned the Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth. This is where the story gets strange. Bloodworth arrived around 2 a.m. The fire was already consuming multiple houses and moving toward the Thames riverfront warehouses. Experienced firefighters were calling for immediate demolitions. But Bloodworth looked at the flames and said something that history recorded. "Pish! A woman might piss it out." Then he went back to bed. By the time he returned in the morning, it was too late. The fire had reached the warehouses on Thames Street. Warehouses packed with lamp oil, turpentine, tallow, coal, and combustible goods. The flames exploded into an inferno that would burn for 4 days. But here's what disturbed me. Bloodworth wasn't incompetent. He'd been Lord Mayor for over a year. He understood how fires worked. London had experienced major fires in 1212 and 1633. Everyone knew the protocol. Create firebreaks immediately. So why did he refuse? Why did he dismiss the most experienced firefighters and go back to bed? Unless he was supposed to let it burn. I spent months mapping the fire's progression, trying to understand how it moved through the city. The official explanation blames the wind. It was a hot, dry summer. There hadn't been rain in weeks. An east wind fanned the flames and drove the fire westward through the medieval timber buildings, but the pattern doesn't match random wind-driven spread. The fire started on Pudding Lane near London Bridge. Within hours, it had jumped Fish Street Hill and reached Thames Street. Then it moved methodically through the wealthiest commercial district, Cheapside, Cornhill, Lombard Street, the financial heart of London. On September 4th, the third day, the fire reached the Guildhall. The Guildhall was the center of London's government. It housed the Corporation of London. It contained centuries of civic records, legal documents, property deeds, and historical archives dating back to the 12th century. The building was constructed of stone, much more fire-resistant than the timber houses surrounding it. It had survived for over 500 years. It had weathered the 1212 fire and the 1633 fire. But on September 4th, 1666, it burned. The roof collapsed. The interior was gutted. The library was destroyed completely. Every record inside turned to ash. That same day, the fire consumed the Royal Exchange, the center of London's financial trade, where merchants kept their contracts and trade records. Then St. Paul's Cathedral. Medieval St. Paul's was one of the largest cathedrals in Europe. It had a 500-foot spire that dominated the London skyline. The building was mostly stone, It had massive walls. It was surrounded by open plazas that should have acted as natural firebreaks. People fleeing the fire took refuge inside, thinking the stone building would protect them. They were wrong. The fire reached St. Paul's around 8 p.m. on September 4th. The wooden scaffolding that had been erected for repairs caught fire first. Then the heat cracked the stonework. The lead roof melted. Witnesses described molten lead pouring down the streets like rivers. The cathedral collapsed. The library inside was destroyed. Ancient manuscripts, historical documents, religious texts dating back centuries, all of it gone. By the end of September 4th, London had lost its government records, its financial records, and its religious records. Everything documenting the city's medieval past had been reduced to ash, and the fire was still burning. I found something in Samuel Pepys's diary that changed how I understood the fire. Pepys was a naval administrator who lived through the Great Fire. He kept detailed daily entries. His diary is one of the primary sources historians use to understand what happened. On September 5th, Pepys climbed the steeple of All Hallows by the Tower Church. From there, he could see across the devastated city. He wrote about the saddest sight of desolation he'd ever witnessed, but he also wrote something else. He described walking through areas where the fire had passed. The ground was so hot it burned his feet. Cellars were still burning. Oil cellars. Brimstone cellars. The fire had gone underground. And then he mentioned something strange. He said some cellars would continue burning for months. He specifically noted that in March 1667, 6 months after the fire ended, some underground spaces were still smoldering. That's not normal. Wood burns out in hours, maybe days. Even coal burns out eventually. But these fires kept burning for months. What was underground that could sustain combustion for half a year? I started looking at maps of medieval London, trying to understand what existed beneath the streets. London had been continuously inhabited since Roman times, nearly 1,500 years of construction. Layer upon layer of older buildings, foundations, tunnels, and infrastructure built on top of previous civilizations. The Romans built sewers, medieval Londoners built crypts and cellars. There were underground passages connecting major buildings, storage vaults beneath churches, tunnels running from the riverfront to inland warehouses, and all of it was hidden. All of it buried under centuries of construction. All of it erased when the Great Fire burned so hot it melted stone and turned earth to glass. What if the fire wasn't meant to destroy the surface city? What if it was meant to destroy what lay beneath? The death toll has never made sense. The official record lists 6 deaths. Some modern estimates go as high as 16. But even 16 deaths seems impossibly low for a disaster that left 100,000 people homeless and destroyed 80% of London. The population of London in 1666 was somewhere between 350,000 and 500,000 people. The fire burned for 4 days. It consumed 436 acres of densely packed timber houses, many of them 4 or 5 stories tall, leaning so close together that upper floors nearly touched across the narrow streets. And only 6 people died? Historians explain this by saying people had time to escape. The fire moved slowly enough that most could flee to the surrounding hills or cross the river to safety. But I found something that challenges that explanation. Multiple contemporary accounts describe people trapped by the flames, houses collapsing with families still inside, entire streets consumed in minutes when the fire reached oil warehouses, explosions from burning timber yards, panic in the narrow alleyways. Pepys himself described seeing bodies in the streets. He wrote about people who died from smoke inhalation. He mentioned finding charred remains in collapsed buildings. So why do the official records only list 6 deaths? Because most of the dead were never counted. The fire burned so hot, it cremated bodies completely. No remains, no identification, no official death. If you were poor, if you were a servant, if you were a foreigner, if you had no family to report you missing, you simply disappeared. The fire erased you as thoroughly as it erased the medieval buildings. The real death toll was likely hundreds, possibly thousands. All of them vanished from history because the records that would have documented their existence burned in the Guildhall. Within a week of the fire ending, Christopher Wren submitted plans to rebuild London. Let me emphasize that timeline. The fire was extinguished on September 6th. By September 11th, Wren had surveyed the entire devastated area and produced a complete redesign of the city. 5 days. He surveyed 436 acres of smoking ruins, calculated new street layouts, designed a grid system, planned new public spaces, and submitted detailed architectural proposals. In 5 days. That's not possible. Not in 1666. Not without pre-existing plans. Wren's proposal was radical. He wanted to completely abandon the medieval street pattern. He proposed wide boulevards radiating from central piazzas, a grid system modeled after Paris and Rome, straight streets, open spaces, Baroque urban planning that would have transformed London into a European capital. His plan was perfect. too perfect, as if he'd been waiting for the opportunity to implement it, and he wasn't alone. John Evelyn submitted plans, Robert Hooke submitted plans, Valentine Knight submitted plans. Multiple architects had complete rebuilding schemes ready within days of the fire. How did they all produce detailed city plans so quickly? Unless they already had them prepared, unless they knew the old city was going to be destroyed. The official explanation is that these were visionaries seizing an unexpected opportunity. The fire created a blank canvas, and ambitious architects rushed to fill it. But the timing suggests something else. It suggests coordination. It suggests foreknowledge. Wren's plan was ultimately rejected. Property owners insisted on keeping their old lot boundaries. The cost of total reconstruction was deemed too high. London was rebuilt largely following the old street pattern. But the buildings were different, completely different. Medieval London was timber, thatch, and plaster. The new London was brick and stone. Medieval London had narrow, winding streets with buildings that leaned and arched over the lanes. The new London had wider streets and buildings that stood straight. Medieval London had 109 parish churches. The new London had 51 churches, designed by Christopher Wren, all of them in a new architectural style. All of them with domes and spires that referenced Italian Baroque rather than Gothic English. The old city was erased, the new city was built on its ashes, and the only evidence of what came before was destroyed in the fire. I started finding mentions of what was lost. The Guildhall library contained records dating back to 1128, 500 years, of London's history, property records, tax rolls, legal proceedings, birth and death registries, all destroyed. Parish churches kept their own records, baptisms, marriages, burials, some going back to the 13th century. 87 of those churches burned, their records burned with them. The Royal Exchange housed merchant contracts and trade documents, international agreements, financial records documenting London's commercial network, gone. Company halls, the headquarters of London's trade guilds, burned. 52 of them, each one containing centuries of apprenticeship records, membership rolls, and guild documents. The loss was so complete that researchers today struggle to reconstruct basic facts about medieval London, where streets ran, who owned property, what buildings looked like. The fire didn't just destroy physical structures, it destroyed London's documented memory. And here's what disturbed me most. The fire seemed to target these record-keeping institutions specifically. Look at the timeline. The fire started at Pudding Lane on September 2nd. By September 4th, it had consumed the Guildhall, the Royal Exchange, and St. Paul's, all in one day, the three most important repositories of London's records. Then the fire continued burning residential areas for 2 more days. But the damage to history was already done. The records were already ash. If you wanted to erase evidence of London's past, this is exactly the pattern you'd see. Records first, buildings second. The rebuilding happened with remarkable speed. The Rebuilding of London Act was passed in February 1667, just 5 months after the fire. The Act established building codes, material requirements, and funding mechanisms. It regulated everything from street widths to window sizes to chimney construction. Christopher Wren was appointed Surveyor of the King's Works in 1669, effectively giving him control over all government building projects. He was 37 years old. He'd been studying architecture for only a few years. Yet he was given responsibility for rebuilding an entire city. By 1670, reconstruction was accelerating. New brick buildings were rising from the ashes. A tax on coal provided funding for church rebuilding. Within a decade, most of the city had been reconstructed. St. Paul's Cathedral was begun in 1675 and completed in 1711. 36 years of continuous construction. The result was a building that looked nothing like medieval St. Paul's. It was crowned with a massive dome, the first of its kind in England. It referenced St. Peter's in Rome and Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. It was Renaissance architecture, not Gothic. The 51 new churches Wren designed were the same. They abandoned English medieval style completely. Domes, columns, classical proportions, Italian Baroque elements, as if London had been transplanted from England to Italy. The new London bore almost no resemblance to the old, and that was intentional. The Rebuilding Act specifically banned timber construction. All new buildings had to be brick or stone. Thatch roofs were prohibited. Street widths were mandated. Building heights were regulated. It was systematic, coordinated. As if someone had decided that medieval London needed to be completely erased and replaced with something different. I kept finding connections to other events. The Great Fire happened in September 1666. 1 year earlier, in 1665, London had experienced the Great Plague, the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in England. Between 75,000 and 100,000 people died, about 20% of London's population. The official explanation is that these were separate disasters. Plague in 1665, fire in 1666, unrelated catastrophes that happened to occur back to back. But some contemporary observers saw it differently. They believed the fire cleansed London of plague. The intense heat sterilized the disease. The destruction of overcrowded medieval slums eliminated the conditions that spread infection. And they were partly right. There were no more major plague outbreaks in London after 1666. The disease that had returned repeatedly for centuries suddenly stopped. But here's what's interesting. The plague had already been declining before the fire. Cases had dropped significantly by autumn 1665. The fire happened almost a full year later. If the fire was responsible for ending the plague, why did the plague decline months before London burned? Unless both events were connected to something else, something that changed in 1665 and culminated in the fire of 1666. I found references to unusual weather patterns. 1665 was cold and wet. 1666 was hot and dry. The winter of 1665 to 66 was described as particularly harsh. Then summer. 1666 was one of the hottest on record with no rain for weeks. Climate fluctuations, disease, fire, population displacement, rebuilding, all happening in compressed succession, as if London was being systematically transformed. They blamed foreigners for starting the fire. England was at war with the Netherlands in 1666, the Second Anglo-Dutch War. Londoners immediately suspected Dutch or French agents of deliberately setting the fire. Catholic plots were alleged. Conspiracies were investigated. Armed mobs attacked anyone with a foreign accent. People were beaten in the streets. Houses were destroyed. The paranoia was intense. A French watchmaker named Robert Hubert confessed to starting the fire. He claimed he was part of a gang that firebombed Farriner's bakery. He was convicted and hanged in October 1666. After his execution, investigators discovered he'd been on a ship in the North Sea on September 2nd. He arrived in London 2 days after the fire started. His confession was false. He'd been executed for a crime he couldn't have committed. But the authorities didn't correct the record. They'd found their scapegoat. The investigation was closed. A parliamentary committee examined the fire's cause. Their conclusion was, the hand of God upon us, a great wind in the season so very dry. An act of God, no human conspiracy. But they also noted the suspicious timing. The fire started just after midnight when most people were asleep. It began at a bakery that should have had its ovens extinguished hours earlier. It spread with remarkable speed toward the most important civic buildings. The committee couldn't prove arson, but they couldn't rule it out either, and the question remains. If this was an accident, why did it start at the King's baker's establishment? Why did the Lord Mayor refuse to create firebreaks? Why did the fire target record-keeping institutions? Why were architectural plans ready within days? Too many coincidences. Too much that doesn't make sense, unless it wasn't an accident at all. I went back to look at medieval London before the fire. The street plan was chaotic, winding lanes barely wide enough for a cart, buildings that leaned over the streets, their upper floors almost touching. No central planning, 1,500 years of organic growth layered on top of Roman foundations. But the architecture was sophisticated. Gothic churches with soaring vaults and intricate stonework, timber-frame buildings with elaborate joinery, structures that had stood for centuries. And beneath it all, Roman infrastructure, walls, roads, sewers, foundations. An entire city built by an advanced civilization, still partially intact beneath medieval construction. What if medieval London was built on top of something even older, something more advanced? What if the Romans weren't the first to build there? I found references to unusual building techniques in some of the oldest structures. Stone blocks fitted so precisely no mortar was needed. Foundations that went down farther than Roman construction typically required. Tunnels and crypts that seemed too sophisticated for their supposed age. All of it destroyed in the fire. All of it erased when the city was rebuilt. The new London had different proportions, different materials, different everything, as if the builders weren't trying to replicate what came before, as if they were deliberately replacing it with something incompatible. Christopher Wren's churches were built on the sites of medieval churches, but they didn't match the old foundations. In many cases, the medieval crypts were filled in, the old ground levels were raised, the new buildings sat higher than the old ones, as if they were burying what came before, literally covering it up. The monument was erected between 1671 and 1677 to commemorate the fire. It stands 202 feet tall, exactly 202 feet from where the fire started on Pudding Lane. A fluted Doric column topped with a golden urn of fire. The inscription reads, "In the year of Christ, 1666, on September the 2nd, at a distance eastward of this place of 202 feet, which is the height of this column, a terrible fire broke out which, driven by a high wind, not only wasted the adjacent parts, but also places very remote, with incredible noise and fury. It describes the destruction, lists the buildings lost, mentions the speed of reconstruction. But it also contains something else, a relief panel on the north side, showing King Charles II and the Duke of York in Roman dress, directing the rebuilding of London. Behind them, allegorical figures represent London rising from the ashes. The imagery is deliberate. London as a new Rome, Charles as Caesar, the fire as an opportunity for transformation rather than disaster. The monument wasn't just commemorating the fire, it was celebrating what came after, the erasure of medieval London, the construction of something new, and at the very top, that golden urn of flames, not mourning the destruction, glorifying it. I kept finding details that didn't fit the official narrative. The fire supposedly ended on September 6th, but Pepys noted fires still burning in March 1667, 6 months later. The death toll was supposedly 6 people, but contemporary accounts describe bodies in the streets and families trapped in burning buildings. The fire was supposedly accidental, but multiple architects had rebuilding plans ready within a week. Medieval London supposedly burned because it was timber and thatch, but stone buildings like the Guildhall and St. Paul's also burned completely. The reconstruction supposedly followed the old street plan, but the buildings, the architecture, the entire character of the city changed completely. Every time I looked closer, the official explanation fell apart. The details didn't match. The timeline didn't work. The outcomes were too convenient. If you wanted to erase a city's history and rebuild it from scratch, this is exactly what you'd do. You'd start a fire in the middle of the night when people were asleep. You'd make sure firefighting efforts were delayed. You'd let the fire consume the record-keeping institutions first. Then, you'd let it burn everything else. When it was over, you'd destroy any evidence of arson. You'd blame foreigners or divine judgment. You'd execute a convenient scapegoat. Then you'd rebuild quickly before people could document what was lost. You'd use new materials, new designs, new proportions. You'd raise the street levels. You'd fill in the old foundations. You'd create a new city on the ashes of the old. And within a generation, no one would remember what came before. The Great Fire of London destroyed 13,200 houses in 4 days. It destroyed 87 parish churches, the Guildhall, St. Paul's Cathedral, the Royal Exchange, 52 company halls, 436 acres of medieval city. It destroyed 5 centuries of civic records, property documents, legal records, birth and death registries, trade agreements, church manuscripts, historical archives. It left 100,000 people homeless. It killed at least hundreds, probably thousands. It erased London's documented memory. And within a decade, it had been replaced. New London, brick instead of timber, Baroque instead of Gothic, wide streets instead of narrow lanes, regulated instead of organic. The official explanation is accident and opportunity. A baker's oven, a strong wind, a dry summer. Ambitious architects seizing a chance to modernize. But when you examine the pattern, when you follow the timeline, when you see what burned first and what was built after, a different picture emerges. The Great Fire of London wasn't a disaster. It was a reset, a systematic destruction of everything documenting the old city. Everything showing what London was before 1666. Everything preserved from Roman, Saxon, and medieval times. All of it turned to ash in 4 days. All of it replaced with something new. Something that looked backward to Rome and forward to empire, but erased everything in between. The records burned first, then the city, then they rebuilt it differently, and we've been living in that rebuilt city ever since, walking streets that follow medieval patterns but are lined with buildings from a different world, worshipping in churches that sit on ancient foundations but reference Italian architecture, looking at a city that claims continuity with its past but systematically destroyed all evidence of what that past actually was. 4 days in September 1666, 13,200 houses. The archives of a civilization, all of it gone. And in its place, a city that looks like it always belonged to Christopher Wren's vision. As if medieval London never existed, as if the Gothic English city was just a dream and the Baroque replacement was always inevitable. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe Thomas Fariner really did leave coals burning in his oven. Maybe the wind really did drive random flames through the most important buildings in London. Maybe Christopher Wren really did design an entire city in 5 days. Or maybe September 1666 was the month they decided that medieval London needed to disappear, that the records needed to burn, that the old city needed to be erased so completely that future generations would never know what was lost. The evidence is still there, in the suspicious timeline, in the targeted destruction of archives, in the impossibly fast rebuilding, in the complete transformation of architectural style, in the systematic raising of street levels to bury the old foundations, in the fact that we can't reconstruct what medieval London actually looked like because all the records burned in the Guildhall, 13,200 houses destroyed in 4 days, and the records burned first.